Hello and welcome to a book club that this month takes some of us back to a remarkable time, because I'm speaking to you from an underground room in an alley in Liverpool. It's the Cavern, where 50 years ago, from this year, 2012, the sound of this city embraced the world.
Love, love me do. You know I love you. I'll always be true. So please, love me do.
I don't think I really need to say much else, do I? Another Beatles anniversary coming up, and here we are in Matthew Street in Liverpool, where it all began. And with us, the writer Hunter Davies, who, to the undying envy of everyone of a certain age, was the first to tell the serious story of the Beatles. He spent 18 months or so with them at their zenith, and his is still the only authorised biography in print after more than 40 years, something he never expected to see. So our readers this month have been revisiting that story of how the Beatles came together, the lightning speed of their fame, the surprisingly short years on the road, the ways in which they diverged, of course, their legacy. It's one of the great folk tales of our era, maybe in part because it began in an age that, from the perspective of organised celebrity in our own time, seems so innocent. Hunter Davies, the first and lasting Beatles biographer, welcome to Book Club.
Hi there.
Innocence is important because people forget how innocent the age was from which they sprang, don't they?
You could say that they stayed innocent to the end. George Harrison, in many ways, was an innocent person. John was an innocent person because they were seeking all their life and they were spiritual. So part of them was hard and tough and could be horrible. But part of them remained naive and innocent to the end. And that was part of their charm.
When you began to tell the story, what was it that convinced you that it was a tale that was out of the ordinary?
When I started the book and got the contract in 1966, people told me we know everything we want to know about the Beatles.
They were already famous, they were already rich.
Exactly. And secondly, the bubble will burst. And there was part of me that thought the bubble was bound to burst, in the sense that a new group was bound to come along. It was so amazing that four blokes from the one little area of Liverpool should come together. If it happened then, it's bound to happen. And for 10 years, I thought somebody will replace them, not in my affections, but in world affections. And people did come along later, like Michael Jackson, who sold more records at a certain time, but nobody was going to supersede them in the way that they were creative, giving us 150 songs that will be sung as long as we've got breath in our body.
And it's the business of the change, isn't it, that happened at that moment, which people who weren't around at the time, I think, find it hard to recover, because celebrity now seems to proceed on a kind of track, where you know there is a path that you follow. This was being done almost for the first time.
Yeah, because they were singing for people like me from my background, and I identified with them, coming from the north, coming from a grammar school, coming from a council house, and they were singing in their own voices. Before them, people sang in a mid-Atlantic accent in a shiny suit, and they were totally phony and pretentious. The Beatles were themselves on stage, and secondly, they sang in a Liverpool accent, and they sang about Penny Lane. It wasn't Chicago or California or let's go to San Francisco. That, to me, at the time was so amazing. And everybody of a certain age, you as well, Jim, will remember a new Beatles album coming out. You rushed to it because you knew it would be not like the previous one. You knew they'd have new ideas, new music, new instruments, apart from new songs. And it was a massive event. I would suggest that doesn't happen anymore.
Well, let's talk to our readers here in the depths of the Cavern in Liverpool about that experience and about the book. Let's have the first question here.
Hello, Hunter. I wonder whether you felt that all four Beatles were equally supportive and committed to the biography we were writing, or were some of them more forthcoming than others?
I put the idea when I met Paul McCartney. I was doing a film called Here We Go Around the Mulberry Bush. It was a novel I'd written, was becoming a film, and I hoped Paul would do the music for it, because he did a few theme tunes in the 60s. And I put the idea to him that there should be a proper hardback biography. There'd been two little sketchy books, and I said, for the rest of your life, you can say to them, when they ask you the same boring questions, why are the Beatles spelt that funny way? We don't think about it now, do we? And why is your hair like that? I said, you can tell them it's all in the book. So I went to see Brian Epstein.
Brian Epstein, the manager and impresario.
And he agreed. And all four Beatles agreed. I had no problems with any of them. I suppose the only problem I had was George. in the sense that he was bored rigid by being a Beatle.
He sort of
He was
wanted
bored-
out of it even before it had finished.
Exactly. He'd moved on to other things, and he didn't want to really talk about his Beatle days, which had only happened yesterday. It was only 66, 67. So
And
there
he was
still,
only, what, 17, 18,
when it
19?
began. But he wanted to move on, and all that was sort of trivial and historic. But I had no obstruction. They told me the truth. Some of the truths I couldn't quite, about all the groupies, I couldn't write it in 96.
Well, I think John Lennon in the 70s suggested that it might be a whitewash.
That
didn't
was
he?
horrible. I was so furious with that. He gave an interview to Rolling Stone, and he said my book was a whitewash. Now, I changed a couple of things for John. A remark about Julia's, his mum's partner, and I had to keep his Aunt Mimi quiet, but there was no whitewash. I rang him up in New York and said, what do you mean saying it's a whitewash? At the time when it came out, everybody said it was the most frank and fearless biography, because I had F-U-C-K was in it, I had LSD, I had most appalling things about their drunkenness. I spoke to John and said, this is unfair. He said, oh, you know me, I just say anything that comes into my head. He was at a stage when he was ashamed of being a mop top. He was ashamed of wearing a lovely suit. He wanted to be a rebel. So he actually was giving interviews at the time, which he was making out himself to be worse than he was. So
if you
I had no objection from anybody, and John had no objections. It was just his Aunt Mimi wanted to... She denied he swore as a boy. She denied he stole things as a boy. I went down to see her in Bournemouth. So I didn't change anything, but I put in at the end of that chapter on John's childhood a quote from Mimi saying, words to the effect, and John was as happy as the day was long. And you know he wasn't. But that kept Mimi happy.
Brian Epstein's mother was a problem.
I didn't put in that Brian was homosexual. First of all, at the time, we were on the cusp, 1968, of the law changing. And I wanted to put it in because, on the face of it, why does it matter? But on the other hand, why did a posh, middle-class public school boy who loved Sibelius fall in love with the Beatles? And my theory was, the reason why I'd fallen in love with the Beatles, especially John, everybody thought he fancied Paul because Paul was the pretty one,
But that wasn't what it was about.
he fancied John most of all.
And did he know that?
Well, John had...
He claimed various things.
He claimed various things. They didn't really discuss Brian's sexuality with Brian.
It was a different age.
They knew he was gay, and that was it. Nothing was. People in Liverpool, in a coterie, in a small circle, knew about Brian, but it was never discussed. It was never mentioned.
Can I go back to Jim's comment earlier about the age of innocence that this book describes? Because I thought there was also, without accusing him of being dated, there was a lot of innocence and naivety in the style that the book was written in. Could I ask you how you think you might write that differently today?
Are you criticising my book?
Not at all, sir. I enjoyed it
It's rather
immensely.
a good question, I think, isn't it?
It is true. I wrote it at the end in a terrible hurry. Things were still happening, and also the Beatles were still at their height. Nobody knew they were going to pack up in a couple of years. In fact, I forgot to say in the new version of the book, when I went to see Brian Epstein to sign the contract, he offered me, without being asked, he said, I'll tell you what, I'll make sure no other writer gets access to the Beatles for 2 years after your book comes out. We never asked for that, but we put it in the contract.
That's quite something.
The book came out in 68. 1970, the Beatles didn't exist anymore. So that's how, by chance, I became the only ever authorised writer. But at the time, in 1968, when I was doing it, I thought there's so much more to come. Apple had started, but I never knew it was going to end in tears.
You see,
So I didn't want to sum up. I didn't want to have poncy prose. I had several chapters out of about 50,000 words I chucked out about their influence on music, on fashion, on clothes and language. I thought, this is so highfalutin, I'll chuck all that out. I've had this amazing, unique experience of being in the studio for 18 months, listening to them performing. And I've talked to them in their homes and their mums and dads, who will obviously die because they were getting on. So I thought I'll just stick to the bare facts. And the first, what we call in book publishing, it's now a primary source. But I didn't put myself into the book at all. There's no first-person stuff. I just tried to describe what I saw and what was happening.
With so much disparate material at the point that you need to pull the book together, and of course in the days before computers, what did you do to plan the structure of the book itself?
I didn't want to stop writing the book, because this was 1966, 68 roughly. Every time they told me something, the next day they'd change their mind. New things were happening, new albums would come out, new theories. And I thought, I want to carry on researching forever, so I had to draw a line and start knocking it into shape. And obviously, the book itself is basically chronological. I go from the four families, the four background, the mums and dads, because at the time I was able to see all the mums and dads. I had access to them. They'd moved into their posh bungalows and were totally dislocated, like Ringo's mother and stepfather. Mimi was still alive. I also managed to track down Freddie, John's father, at the last moment. I found him washing up dishes very near Weybridge, where John was living. And I talked to him and I heard his story, half of which I didn't really believe. But I met him and I told John I'd met your dad, because his dad, as you know, did a runner. Although some people in the family think it was Julia was the bad one. And I told John that I'd met him, and he invited Freddie to come and see him, and he gave him all this money and a house and looked after him. So that happened at the very last moment. So the first chapter, which is the background to John's earlier life, is all a bit jagged, because I'd suddenly found John's father at the end of the book.
Is Ringo Starr the luckiest man in the world to be there when the bubble was formed? And as the authorised author of this fabulous biography, you're the second luckiest man to be part of this changing history.
That's true. I count my blessings all the time.
New industry.
But we didn't know it at the time. When I was doing my book, I got some albums stolen, signed copies of Sgt. Pepper. And when I claimed on the insurance, I claimed £3.50 for the album, because there was no value in the fact it was signed by the Beatles. And I picked up these scraps from the floor of Abbey Road. When I've been there during, say, Sgt. Pepper or various songs, at the end of the evening I would say, can I take this scrap because it will help me? He said, of course. The cleaners will burn all these things unless you take them away. At the time, they're only lads in their 20s. To them it seemed totally stupid, because they weren't interested in yesterday, where they'd come from. They were only interested in the next thing. So I took these scraps and I kept them for about 10 years. I used some in the book, and then had them on the wall. Then I woke up one day in 1980 and found that these scraps of paper were worth more than my house. I thought, oh God. This was the first Sotheby's sales in 1981. So I rang the British Museum. I thought they would say, oh, we don't want this besides Shakespeare and Magna Carta. But they jumped it, and it went into the British Library. And when the Queen opened the British Library, my 8 lyrics are there, next to Magna Carta and Shakespeare and Beethoven and Wordsworth. And when the Queen went round, it was the thing she stopped at most, because obviously she can understand the words of yesterday more than she can understand Magna Carta, as I can't. Jim can, because he does medieval Latin. And in my will, it goes to the nation, because I feel I got them by chance, and I couldn't dare sell them.
We want to hear something from the book, Hunter, and this passage, which you're going to read, comes from very much that time of Sgt. Pepper. Set the scene and read the passage.
I follow it chronologically for the first half of the book. Now, when I've got them all established, I have a huge chapter called Music, and this was just how they made their music in Abbey Road, observing them making the music. And I now wish, well, I wish first of all I used a tape recorder when I was interviewing them, which I never did. I did it in little notebooks. And I wish I'd done more chapters about the music, because being there in Abbey Road, I was in the bowels of where they were making their music with the headphones on, and George Martin was up high behind a glass panel with the other producers, and if the Wives came or Mick Jagger came, they sat up there. I was down below with the roadies Neil and Mal helping to move things around. And I only wish I'd written more about those songs, because looking back at the book, to me, the best stuff in the book is how they made their songs. Other things about their life story, being at school and the quarrymen, that's been written a million times since. Obviously they don't get the Beatles, and my story of their early life has been improved upon. But nobody's improved upon first-hand account of how they were writing their music, because obviously they stopped 2 years later and it never happened again. And funnily enough, I didn't write it in the first person, but this little description about Paul walking when a song comes to him, I'm actually with him, and he's actually talking to me, and we sparked it off. Another afternoon, it was the first afternoon of spring, and Paul went for a walk with his dog Martha. John still hadn't arrived for their latest recording work on Sgt. Pepper. He pushed Martha into his Aston Martin and got him beside her and started the car. He drove to Primrose Hill, where he parked the car, and left it without locking it. He never locks his cars. Martha ran around and the sun came out. Paul thought it really was spring at last. It's getting better, he said to himself. He meant the weather But the phrase made him smile because it was one of Jimmy Nichols's phrases, one of which they used to mock all the time in Australia. When Ringo was ill and unable to play, Jimmy Nichols deputised for him on part of the Australian tour. Every time one of them asked Jimmy how it was getting on, all he ever replied was, "It's getting better." That day at 2 o'clock when John came round to write a new song, Paul suggested, "Let's do a song called It's Getting Better." So they got going, both of them singing, improvising and messing around. When the tune was at last taking shape, Paul said, "You've got to admit, it is getting better." "Did you say you've got to admit it's getting better?" Then John sang those words as well. And so it went on till 2 in the morning. People came to see Paul, some by appointment. They were left waiting downstairs, reading, or were sent away. They stopped once for a meal, a quick fry-up. The next evening, Paul and John went to the recording studio. Paul played the new song on the piano, La La in the accompaniment, or banging in tune to his own words, to give the others an idea of what it sounded like. Ringo and George said they liked it, and so did George Martin.
And that's how it was.
Yeah, most of the time, I've got to admit, in Abbey Road during these 18 months, I was bored out of my skull because they were going over and over and over. And I couldn't see the difference between one version and another version. They'd go
But they
on
could.
and on and on. So they worked so hard, and you forget that. So I suppose that was the only song that I saw from the first Genesis to the very end. A lot of other songs I saw halfway through, or I saw a beginning. I remember I was with John when I went to his house once, Kenwood, it was called, in Weybridge, and I arrived by appointment, and it turned out it was a day for not talking. So we had lunch, Cynthia made lunch, not talking. We watched children's television, not talking. I was thinking, bloody hell.
Literally not talking.
I've come all that way. Then we went for a swim in his pool. He just decided not to talk. And as we were swimming round his pool, we could hear a police siren going, ah. John, even though he wasn't talking, started playing with that. It's not a tune, it's a rhythm. I can't do it very well. Which, as you all know if you're Beatles fans, eventually became Across the Universe. John, unlike Paul, was very bad at finishing things. He would start it and get bored and couldn't remember and do something else. So that particular song started then, but it was many months before it became Across the Universe.
You're listening to Book Club on BBC Radio 4. Hunter Davies is talking about his biography of the Beatles, published in the 60s and still in print.
Hunter, we've talked a lot about the Beatles and their music. Just interested about the Beatles and their words. When you were talking about that extract, what struck me was we don't perhaps talk enough about their words. When you were carrying out your research, did you get a sense of where that love of language and the playfulness with words came from?
John, as we know, loved Alice in Wonderland. He loved Robert Louis Stevenson. He loved Just William. He read a great deal as a boy. And he loved wordplay. So he always was obsessed by words. One of the things in the music chapter, they're writing a song, can't remember what it was, and they're trying to complete it because they had the first 4 lines and trying the next 4 lines. And Paul says something like, and we'll do it in just a minute. And John says to him, you never use the word just. Just is just a fill-in word. And that was such a good English type observation, which is true. It's a non-word. The first time I ever met the Beatles properly was when I went to interview Paul when I was doing a column called Atticus in the Sunday Times, 1966. And Eleanor Rigby had come out, and I thought, it's not just the music. I thought those words are stunning. And I said in the piece, it's the best verse, the best poetry, forget the song, published in 1966, just saying it to annoy Sunday Times readers at the time. But I believed it. I thought the words were absolutely brilliant. And that is one of the many amazing things about the Beatles. Their words were as good as their songs.
There's a question here and then over here.
Do you think that today, the way media is today, you'd have the same relationship now with celebrities and the same access and trust that you had then?
Well, I did Wayne Rooney's biography last year, and we were best friends for the time I was doing it.
The difference between the way a celebrity who seemed to have some talent, whether it's on a football pitch or in music now, carries on is so different from then, isn't it? I mean, that's the big change, which you document and talk about in the introduction.
I think the question was, would I get the access to a celebrity today? If I had the contract, I'd got on with them, and I was observing them, and I very carefully tried to be a fly on the wall. I spent the first 6 months really not talking to the Beatles I went to see Astrid in Hamburg. I went to see Pete Best in Liverpool. I went to see the mums and dads. And I brought back chat from their life and told them it. So I carefully worked my way in.
You just mentioned Pete Best.
Yeah.
Was it petty jealousy, clash of personality, or was he just an inferior drummer compared to Ringo when he was given the boot from the
And
Quarrymen?
he's still around, isn't he?
Still around. There's no one answer to that. Pete obviously was heartbroken. He'd been with them in Hamburg. He'd been with them for what it was 2 years. He'd done the first Love Me Do version, and they chucked him. They did it sneakily and not to his face. They got Brian to chuck him.
Who was behind it?
I don't know. Nobody knows. Everybody has theories. Pete Best has his own theory. I think it was really that they saw in Ringo, I didn't answer the Ringo question, did I? They saw in Ringo a kindred spirit. They saw him as a chum, and you could say Ringo was the luckiest person alive. But in many ways, he was a vital part of the jigsaw. He gave something to the group that the other three didn't give. So Pete Best was very unlucky. When I was doing the book, I went back to Liverpool to go to the Casbah Club, and I saw Mona Best, his mother, because she had a big part in their story. And Pete wouldn't see me, and Mona wouldn't see me. I got into the house, this big posh house in Liverpool, and I talked to the mum, got the background, and then eventually I said, well, can I not talk to Pete? What I didn't know was Pete was listening through a crack in the door. And he eventually came out wearing a white uniform, and he'd just come off the night shift slicing bread in a bread factory at £18 a week. And there were the Beatles, multimillionaires, the most famous people in the world. But he wasn't bitter or twisted. He still didn't understand why he was chucked out. One of the things about today, I've met him recently, if you think about it, Pete is still happily married to the same woman. He has a very nice life. He goes on tour with his own group, but he only goes for a few weeks at a time. And of all the Beatles, and don't forget he was a Beatle, he's the only Beatle who was only ever married once. So you could say he turned out the happiest Beatle.
Who's next?
Hunter, I was struck watching the George Harrison biography of Martin Scorsese on the telly, just how George Harrison was still talking like a bloke who just lived next door, even at the end of it all. And I just wonder, it's the biggest phenomenon that's ever happened in popular music. How did they keep their sanity?
Well, as I said, there was part of them that was naive, and there was part of them that never changed, and they didn't really have airs and graces. And because they were always searching, George was always looking for new things. Okay, they had drugs and sex and all that stuff in their late teens and 20s, but by the time that John died, John was living a very sober life. Yes, I loved that Martin Scorsese film. I must tell you one George Harrison story, quickly. I went with the Beatles to see Maharishi at Bangor in 1967. We went on the train. At the last moment, the roadies didn't come, and I was on the first-class carriage with the 4 Beatles, with Mick Jagger and Marianne Faithfull, and we went up to Bangor, and we saw the Maharishi, and we got our mantra, and that evening we went out to a Chinese restaurant, and the roadies had still not come, and we had the meal in this Chinese restaurant, and when the bill came, it was me just with the Beatles. I didn't have enough money. It came to something like 30 quid, and I only had a tenner. I thought, oh God, so I explained to the head waiter, look, these are the Beatles, and they had no idea. I think they just arrived from Hong Kong, all the staff. And I could see them sharpening the knives, because they were used to Scousers coming across on a Saturday evening from Liverpool, running up a big bill and doing a runner. And I thought, oh God, because the Beatles, once they became the Beatles, became like the royal family, they didn't carry money. The roadies carried the money. So I was pleading with them, and suddenly George put his foot on the table, took off his Indian sandal, got a knife, and cut open the top of the leather bit, and pulled out a £20 note. He put it there the day he'd become a multimillionaire and really famous and a Beatle, and the roadies took over, knowing that one day there will come a time when I'll need some cash, and he paid the bill. And it's a good story because it shows that George, while being a spiritual person, off for the fairies and Hare Krishna and all that, also had a foot on the ground, was also sensible, and knew what was happening.
My question is about the breakup of the Beatles and Yoko's part in it. Looking back, it seems that she got an awful lot of stick at the time from fans, but in hindsight, do you think that maybe the Beatles owed her a debt of gratitude in that they were able to blossom as individuals?
The book finishes in 1968, so it's pre the breakup. Obviously, in the modern versions, I've tried to explain what happened. Yoko Ono is now my best friend in the whole world, because I'm doing the John Lennon letters, which will come out in October this year. And there's never been a book of John Lennon letters. I've got 3 letters from him, but the laws of copyright mean you can't use them in a book or a magazine without the copyright holder's permission for 70 years from when they die, and Yoko owns it. And John wrote the most witty, funny, obscene, mad, passionate, lovely letters, which you've never seen. You've seen odd ones when they've been up in auction, but you've never seen them all collected together. So that's what I'm doing now, getting them all together. So I can't have a bad word against Yoko, but Yoko honestly did not break up the Beatles. The Beatles were fed up being the Beatles. Well, 2 were really fed up being the Beatles. George was the first, and John was fed up being the Beatles. Long before Yoko came along, long before Linda came along. Don't forget, if you think of the progression, had given up touring. The next stage was sort of giving up making records. They were doing individual things as well, and doing films and other things. And they wanted to move on to other things. And it was just, John, in many ways, I told you that story about him not talking. John's life at the time was sort of blank and empty. He was wandering around. So Yoko saved him from himself. Yoko opened up new things for him. So Yoko and Linda, you could say, didn't crash the Beatles or break up the Beatles. They saved the Beatles and gave John and Paul extra fulfillment and creative energy.
Thank you all for your questions. Hunter Davies, thank you so much for being our guest in what we might call the Cavern Quarter of Liverpool on Book Club this month, and talking about your biography of the Beatles. Do remember the website, bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. You can follow the links to the programme Book Club there, where you can hear every edition of the programme going right back. You can download this one on podcast. You can find out what's coming up. And if you want to be a reader at one of these recordings, that's where you can let us know. Next month, Sunday the 5th of February, our guest is going to be the extraordinary American writer and graphic artist Art Spiegelman, talking about his novel, a picture novel in a way, and an autobiography too, Mouse. Next week at this time, Mariella Frostrup will be back with Open Book. Meanwhile, from all of us on Book Club, keep reading along until next month and the next book.